Good evening. Well, let's see. We'll get it. We'll get it. Nope, not on. There it is. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Wow, thank you all for coming out this evening. Thank you for being such a punctual crowd, too. I appreciate that. Welcome to the 24th Annual Spirit and Place Festival Public Conversation. My name is Erin Kelly, and I'm the Program Director for Spirit and Place. For anyone who might be unfamiliar with Spirit and Place, we are a legacy project of the Polis Center in the IU School of Liberal Arts at IUPUI. We believe in the power of the arts, humanities, and religion to build community and to catalyze civic engagement. Since 1996, we have selected a theme and invited the community, that is, artists, musicians, congregations, cultural organizations, and others, to interpret that theme through creative and collaborative programming in our annual festival of events. Now, this year's theme was Revolution, and you've noticed we've spelled it with a slash between the R and the E. We really wanted the community to interpret that theme as either revolution or evolution. So whether fast and abrupt or slow and unfolding, the past 10 days have been an exploration of change. Changes we can make in ourselves and changes we can make in society. We've been treated to musical performances, art exhibitions, film screenings, and panel discussions. We've heard personal stories of fitting in. We've explored ways to deeply connect to our spiritual selves, and we've made art together. And folks, we've even talked about aliens during a couple of events. Because this is Spirit and Place, and we've got a little something for everybody, and the incredible inventiveness and relevance of this year's programming is really spectacular. So we've had, this year, as in the past several years, we've nominated 5 events for an award of awesomeness. So we had an event called A Faith Leader and a Scientist Walk Into a Bar that encouraged us to sit down over a beer and talk about our faith and to talk about science. Another Award of Awesomeness nominee was called Songs of Revolution, and it explored the history of music in change-making. Earlier today, at an event that just ended, I think like 30, 40 minutes ago, we were invited to get our sci-fi groove on in an inclusive way at the event, The Evolution of Sci-Fi Fandom. Through rites of passage, we were able to reflect on the healing power of writing for formerly incarcerated men and women. And even the creative director of Def Jam Records, Say Adams, came into town earlier this week for the festival. Now, I want to thank all of our event partners, not only those who created the awesomely nominated events, but everyone who was involved in this festival. So if anyone is in the room who either created an event, spoke at an event, or otherwise organized or something for the festival, would you stand? Because I know there are some of you in here. Can we give them a round of applause? These are the folks who make this festival possible. So again, thank you for making Spirit and Place such a dynamic experience for this community. I also want to thank those partners whose leadership and generosity make Spirit and Place possible itself. The Lilly Endowment, the Allen Whitehill Clues Charitable Foundation, Bolson Group, the Polis Center, and IUPUI. And for tonight's event with Ms. Hannah Jones, I'm particularly grateful to the Central Indiana Community Foundation for their generous support, and to the Butler Arts Center, who helped make all the logistics happen in this space. Hands down, Butler Arts Center staff, you guys have been amazing, and I thank you so much. And I want to give a personal thanks to Dr. Maria Hamilton Abagunde with the IU Bloomington Department of African American and Africa Diaspora Studies, Drs. Rhonda Henry Anthony and Les Etienne with IUPUI's Africana Studies program, and Dr. Jennifer Thorington Springer, IUPUI's Associate Dean to Student Affairs. Their guidance and dedication to tonight was enthusiastic. It was wonderful. It was so helpful. And they are so dedicated to their students. And I want to thank them for working so hard to get some students here earlier in this evening for a conversation that they got to have with Nicole. And I want to say, I realize at this point you're all getting twitchy, and I know you just want me to stop talking because you want to get to the good stuff. So I just need a couple more minutes of your patience here. I do want to talk to you a little bit about the format for tonight's event, tonight's public conversation. We are holding this event Civic Saturday style. Now, Spirit and Place has been conducting Civic Saturday gatherings since the spring of 2018. And Civic Saturdays are gatherings that offer a time of reflection on our civic values. It's a time where we aim to unpack underlying beliefs, values, and ideas concerning what it means to be an American and who even gets to claim that name in its fullness. Civic Saturdays are about intentionally setting aside time to cultivate a shared sense of civic purpose and to work on defining our civic characters. It is only through this intentional work, which often means grappling with hard stuff, being uncomfortable, and oftentimes disagreeing with one another, that we gain the clarity we need to live by and to live out our civic values. That is to put into action values of equality, liberty, freedom, and justice, those things we say we hold dear. Now, being Spirit of Place, of course, we use song, poetry, humanities-based readings, and the structure of ritual to create this intentional environment. So I invite you to check out our next Civic Saturday gathering on April 4th at Central Library, and then again on July 11th. And on July 11th, we will be holding an outdoor civic revival under a tent on the grounds of Central Library, where the originator of Civic Saturdays and the CEO and founder of Citizen University, Eric Liu, will be joining us. So save that date and check it out. So that's Civic Saturday. That's a little bit about the ethos behind the structure of the event tonight. And this is where I stop. We're not going to have any more welcome remarks. There aren't going to be any lengthy introductions of speakers because, let's be honest, if you did not know who Nicole Hannah-Jones was, you wouldn't be here. So we're going to get started with a little community building through song. So please welcome song leader Bambi Aldridge and Spirit and Place's own Pam Blevins-Hinkle, co-founder of Song Squad, to the stage.
Come on out, Song Squad. I know they're back there. So are y'all ready to do a little singing? Yeah, oh, I need a little more affirmation. I got applause over here. Yeah, ready to do some singing.
Good evening. My name is Charisma McMurray, and I am a junior at IUPUI studying psychology with a double minor in Africana Studies and English.
And my name is Maurice Rush, and I also go to IUPUI. I am a senior studying professional writing and writing literacy.
The 1619 Project features 17 literacy works that explore consequential movements in African American history. Tonight, we are sharing two works by the writer and poet Clint Smith. The first poem marks the date of August 1619, when a ship carrying more than 20 enslaved Africans arrived in Port Comfort, Virginia. Eventually, 12.5 million people would have been stolen from Africa and forced to endure the Middle Passage to the New World. August 1619. Over the course of 350 years, 36,000 slave ships crossed the Atlantic Ocean. I walk over to the globe and move my finger back and forth between the fragile continents. I try to keep count how many times my hand drags across the bristled hemispheres, but grow weary of chasing a history that swallowed me. For every 100 people that were captured and enslaved, 40 died before they ever reached the New World. I pull my index finger from Angola to Brazil and feel the bodies jumping from the ship. I drag my thumb from Ghana to Jamaica and feel the weight of dysentery make an anvil of my touch. I slide my ring finger from Senegal to South Carolina and feel the ocean separate a million families. The soft hum of history spins on its tilted axis. A cavalcade of ghost ships washed their hands of all they carried.
The second poem by Clint Smith moves us ahead 306 years to August of 2005, when nearly 30,000 mostly black residents of New Orleans were forced to flee to the Louisiana Superdome for shelter during Hurricane Katrina. August 2005. A helicopter hovers overhead like a black cloud of smoke, its blades dismembering the pewter sky. Men in uniform stand outside with guns nested under their arms in the hot, wet air of August, licking their weary faces. Two women push a homemade raft through warm brown water that raises up and hugs their chest. There is an old man inside the raft who was a stranger to them when such a word meant, "Please help me." Inside, children are running across the emerald turf, jumping through rings of light that spill from the sky onto the field. Their small bodies sprinting between the archipelago of sprawled cots. There is a mother who sits high in the seats of a stadium, rocking her baby back and forth, her voice cocooning the child in a shell of song. Before desperation descended under the rounded roof, before the stench swept across the air like a heavy fog, before the lights went out and the buses arrived, before the cameras came inside and showed the failure of an indifferent nation, there were families inside there. Though there were some who failed to call them families, there were children inside there. Though there were some who gave them a more callous name, there were people inside there. Though there were some who only saw a parade of disembodied shadows. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm LaShonda Crow Storm, the Community Engagement Director for Spirit in Place. I would like us to actually all turn and clap again for our youth that are here, especially the students that just left. Woo woo to the youth. The reality is there is no revolution if we do not bring in youth with us along, because when we get tired, burned out, crash out, it is the youth that we have to pass this work on to. So I'm so thankful that we have included the youth in our work today, because they are the next generation that continues this work forward. So at the root of Spirit in Place is always the desire for us to create community, whether that's not we're having art, whether we're talking about aliens, whether we're having really deep dialogues about what does it mean to fit in. And every time that we come together, it is an opportunity for us to think about how to build community. So right now, I actually want you to all turn to each other and form little groups, or find someone you do not know in this room and spend the next several minutes. I see some of your faces and that you're kind of twitchy about this, and that's okay. But the reality is no revolution can happen if we do not take the step forward to be uncomfortable. And so at this moment, we're asking you to be uncomfortable and spend this next few minutes to really talk with your neighbors or someone you don't know. Why did you come here today? What do you hope can be accomplished? And how do we revolutionize how we think about the history of race, class in this country, how racism continues to manifest, and how does our shared paths actually connect us? So get to it, folks.
right, if everyone can go ahead and begin to wrap up those conversations. Go ahead and make your way back to your seats. I love the sound of strangers talking to each other. Thank you for doing that. I hope you had a good few minutes there of hopefully talking with someone that you maybe have never connected with before. We're going to move on to some civic readings now, so I'd like to welcome Pam Ross and Kathleen Ridley Merriweather to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Pamela Ross. I'm the Vice President of Opportunity, Equity, and Inclusion for Central Indiana Community Foundation. We're really proud to be a sponsor of this particular discussion. We have a lot of love and a lot of admiration and curiosity about you, Ms. Nikole Hannah-Jones. So I've been invited to read a opening essay from Nikole Hannah-Jones entitled, "The Idea of America." The United States is a nation founded on both an idea and a lie. Our Declaration of Independence, signed July 4th, 1776, proclaims that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. But for the white men who drafted those words, did not believe them to be true for hundreds of thousands of black people in their midst. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness did not apply to fully 1/5 of the country. Yet, despite being violently denied the freedom and justice promised to all, Black Americans believe fervently in the American creed. Through centuries of Black resistance and protest, we have helped the country live up to its funding ideals. And not only for ourselves, Black rights struggles have paved the way for every other rights struggle, including women's and gay rights, immigration, and disability rights.
Good afternoon. I'm Kathy Ridley Merriweather, and today I am reading a short literary piece by Kiese Laymon. Full disclosure, I did not know who he was and that he's a he, and so I thought I would let all of you know that Kiese Laymon is an award-winning author and professor of English and creative writing at the University of Mississippi. And these are his words. July 17th, 1984. My older sister, Ray, makes me write 500 words every night before I go to bed. Tonight, I want to write 5 million because of this speech by Jesse Jackson, a Black man with big, beautiful eyeballs. While we were working on the Barnett House tonight, Ray kept saying that Jesse's speech was going to do for us what Ronald Reagan's speech did for white folks at the Neshoba County Fair 4 years ago. Ronald Reagan came to the fair and said some words about states' rights. Those words made a lot of white folks at the fair happier than Christmas Eve. Those words made Ray, Mama, Granny, and our whole church so scared we had to leave. When we got in the van, Ray told me that Ronald Reagan came to Mississippi to offer white folks an all-you-can-eat buffet of Black suffering. I asked Ray if white folks left full. She sucked her teeth. DeFinas, who worked on the house with us this summer, stayed to watch the speech too. He's from Oaxaca, Mexico, and his grandmother was just stolen by police and sent back to Oaxaca. I don't know if Ray and DeFinas go together, but they look at each other's hands like they do. All of us watched Jesse Jackson say the names of people I never heard of at school. He talked about Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. He talked about Fannie Lou Hamer, Martin King, and Rabbi Abraham Heschel. He talked about Hispanic Americans, Arab Americans, African Americans. He talked about lesbian and gay Americans having something called equal protection under the law. He talked about powerful coalitions made of rainbows. When we walked out of the Barnett house, a house we were building, in a white neighborhood where none of us would ever be allowed to live, I watched DeFinas and Ray hug for 8 seconds. On the way home, I asked Ray why she seemed so sad. Rainbows, they're pretty, but they ain't real, she said. Only thing real down here is suffering and work and love. I told Ray that I liked her more than Apple Now Laters. But if believing in rainbows makes us love better, then rainbows can be just as real as work and love. And if we really believed, we might be able to bring DeFinas' granny back. And one day, instead of building houses for white folks in neighborhoods we could never even visit if we weren't working there, we could maybe build beautiful houses with gardens where all our grannies could sit on porches and safely tell lies that sound true. I never seen a black and brown rainbow, Ray said, but I'll always believe in us. I'll be sad when you go to college, I told her, but mostly I'll be fine because I can't stop believing that rainbows are real. And the land and the black and brown folks under those rainbows, we will one day be free. And now, please join me in welcoming Nicole Hannah-Jones to the stage.
Hey. First, I'd like to thank Spirit in Place for convening this and inviting me here and bringing me back to Indiana, a state that I can't say that I love. Let me just set the table a little bit. I don't give inspiring speeches, so if you came here to be inspired, wrong place. But I do hope to give speeches that make us uncomfortable enough to maybe do something different tomorrow. So that's what we're gonna do. So I'm here to talk to you about this little thing you may have heard about called the 1619 Project. I guess I'm supposed to pull this up. There we go. Which I created really in my mind probably some 25 years ago, and then somehow through the universe and the ancestors' help, was able to land in a position to bring it to the rest of the world. So we're gonna start with the theme, and actually the theme is really fitting for what the 1619 Project is trying to do. If we're thinking about the theme of evolution and revolution, then let's just begin imagining what I believe to be true, which is that our true founding was not at the start of the American Revolution in 1776, but our true founding was really 1619, when we decide that we are going to purchase that first group of 20 to 30 people, human beings, and treat them as chattel property. And when we think about how we have come to understand this momentous occasion, which is that most of us had never heard of it. And I remember I first came across the date 1619 as a high school student taking my one semester Black Studies course where we got to learn about all of ancient Africa and all of Black American history to the Civil Rights Movement in 3.5 months. And yet, that 3.5 months was transformative for me because all of that history packed into that 3.5 months was more than the entire history of Black people I had ever learned in all of my 11 years of public school education prior to that. And then, of course, once I learned that, I became a very incorrigible student because I challenged my teachers on everything, and then I realized, oh, this is why they don't teach us these things. But when we think about that, we all know, so that I learned about 1619 in a book, and it was a self-study. I asked that Black Studies teacher, once that course was over, to give me a new book, and every time I finished a book, I'd ask him for another book, and he handed me this book one day called Before the Mayflower. And it's on about page 30 or so of that book that I first came across the year 1619. And it was a lightning bolt, because we all know about the Mayflower. We all know about that little ship in 1620. But none of us had ever been taught about the White Lion in 1619. And I remember thinking, wait, we'd been here longer than they had? But somehow it was important for us to know about the Mayflower, but it was not important for us to know about the White Lion. And of course, I would argue that the people who were on the White Lion were much more important to the history of this country and the country that would develop than the people who were on the Mayflower. You can clutch your pearls, I don't care. So it was at that moment that I really became obsessed with the year 1619. And when I decided to pitch this project and create this project, it was because I have been thinking and working for a very long time as a journalist to trace the legacies of slavery back to modern society and show that which is the fundamental argument of the project, is that despite all of our efforts to obscure slavery, to marginalize slavery, to treat Black people as not essential to the American story, and to treat slavery as not essential to the American story, that really almost nothing about modern American life could be left untouched. And really, 1619 Project, broken down in its smallest part, was my really petty decision to answer the question that every Black person gets, which is, slavery is a long time ago, why don't you get over it? So the project was to show that we can't get over it until y'all get over it. So fundamentally, what the New York Times is attempting to do is a radical reframing of both our origin stories as a country, of our founding dates, and actually who we consider to be our actual founders. Because are the founders the ones who wrote the ideals on paper, or the ones who actually believed in them and fought to make them true? And it was a rare thing for the New York Times to explicitly state a mission, that whole idea of, journalistic objectivity, which I clearly don't believe in. Because we believe that we needed to actually tell people what we were doing and frame this very consciously, the same way, of course, that the history we all are taught was very intentionally framed. Because when we think about how we create a common narrative and we have come to understand a shared sense of national memory, it is as much about what we are taught as about what is left out of what we are taught. And it is about why we feel like the Mayflower tells us something about America that we should know, that glorifies us, but we have to hide and erase the White Lion because that tells a different story from what we want to believe. So we're gonna go have a little bit of a history lesson. If you haven't read the project, there's a lot of history in there. When we think about the transatlantic slave trade, we know that slavery was not invented by European colonial powers, that slavery had existed in many, many parts of the world, including on the continent of Africa. But what is true was that no slavery like chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade existed in the world, that this was a new type of slavery. This is a slavery that was created in a way to dehumanize and to really treat human beings not as humans. And this type of slavery didn't exist. It was a slavery that was racial. So it wasn't conditional. For most of the history of the world, you became enslaved by someone because you fought a war against them and you lost. And you had to pay this back. But your slavery wasn't usually permanent. Your children were not born into slavery. And it wasn't a legacy of slavery for generations. But American slavery was racial, it was heritable. You passed it on to every generation after you. You were treated not as a human who had civil and legal rights, but as property, and the only rights were to the owner of you. It was a type of slavery that created a social death, which meant that enslaved people were not to interact with our social and public institutions, but instead were only to be acted upon. There was the sense that it was to be permanent here, that this was a part of who we were as Black people, was that we would be enslaved forever. The opening with Clint Smith's poem talks about a fact I think a lot of us don't know. It was that ships crossed that ocean 36,000 times, carrying hundreds and hundreds of people who did not willingly submit to that. In fact, so many Africans, some 13 million, were brought across that Middle Passage that they outnumber the number of Europeans who emigrated over to the New World. So think about that for a second. There were more people forced into bondage across that ocean than chose to get on ships and settle what would become called the New World. And of those 13 million, those are the 13 million who survived. There were many, many who died from the march from the central part of Africa out to the coast, who died in the slave castles that were holding them, who died in that Middle Passage, and who died even waiting in the docks in places like Charleston or New Orleans to be transported off the ships. There were so many bodies sometimes in the port of places like Charleston that they stopped letting them come in, and they forced them to stay out further in the ocean because there was a stench of all of the dead African people that they had dumped into the water to allow them to rot. But even with all of this high death rate, it was still profitable, because this is how you packed human beings into the hulls of ships. It was just capitalism. The more people you pack in, you don't have to feed them that much, you don't have to take care of them, you can spend very little money, and if 40% of them die, which was a typical case, you still had enough of them alive to make a great deal of money. I think about the horror of this. I can't even imagine weeks and weeks and weeks. How do you not lose your mind? How do you not lose your spirit? Chained sometimes to people who had already died, chained to people who were sick, having to lay in your own excrement. If you were pregnant, you would give birth right there. So when we think of how we have been taught about slavery, as this somehow, it was kind of bad, you know, like indentured servitude, that is intentional, because we can't look at ourselves as this country that we are if we acknowledge that this is what we did. We actually have records of what it was like on those slave ships, because some enslaved people were able to get educated and become literate and write about what it was like on the passage. This is haunting, because he is talking about how he looked wistfully at those enslaved people who were dying and near death, because he wished he could join them, because that would have been freedom when he was on that ship. That freedom was death if you were living in those horrific conditions. So let's contrast that with the ideas of freedom in our founding documents. I find it useful, I know there's a lot of scholars in here, to compare texts. And when you think about that, for the enslaved person who is cargo on a slave ship, that freedom means death, and they are heading to a country that is ostensibly founded on liberty, it kind of opens very widely and very quickly the founding contradiction and lie. So these words, of course, are the words from the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson. They are some of the most famous words in the English language. Matter of fact, most Americans could probably recite at least this passage without even having to look at the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. Thomas Jefferson is 33 years old when he writes these words. These are the words that are going to make the case to the world why this scrappy group of colonies needs to be able to break off from the most powerful empire in the nation at the time. It is their declaration of the right to be free. But as Thomas Jefferson is writing these words in Philadelphia, he owns 130 human beings who are forced to labor on his slave labor camp that we like to call Monticello. Monticello was a forced labor camp where Black people, through torture, produced the profit and the wealth that allowed a 33-year-old man to be tasked with writing the founding documents of our country. As he writes these words, for liberty, with the ideal that we are endowed by our Creator with natural rights and that all men are created equal, he actually has an enslaved relative sitting next to him. It is his wife's brother, his half-brother. They share the same father, but her half-brother's mother is one of the enslaved people that her father owned. And he is there to keep Thomas Jefferson comfortable while he writes these words of liberty. So when we like to think that the founders somehow didn't understand the hypocrisy of what they were doing, you can't say the man was brilliant and then say he somehow didn't get that he was writing these words and 1/5 of the population, including his own children, would not enjoy those rights. So if we acknowledge that, then we also have to acknowledge that we are a nation both founded on the most beautiful ideas of liberty and also a complete lie. Because that liberty was deprived to 1/5 of the population, and I mean absolute bondage. But that's not the history that we're taught. That's the fact that the founders, 10 of the first 12 presidents, owned other human beings is treated as an asterisk, not as a central theme, as if the people who rise to the presidency aren't the most powerful men in the country, and that if it is somehow just happenstance that the most powerful men in the country own human beings. It is not happenstance. There is a reason for this. And as they are writing the Constitution, we have to stop thinking about our founding the way that we do. We have to understand that we are taught that the Constitution is a document of liberation. It was for white men, but it was also a document of slavery and absolute denial of rights for Black people. It also is a decidedly undemocratic document because most Americans could not vote. They had no franchise under the Constitution as written. White women certainly did not, Native people did not, and Black people, no matter their gender, could not vote under this Constitution. So how do we come to think of our founding as being about freedom and liberty, one person, one vote, believing that we are founded as a democracy when we were actually founded as a slaveocracy, a country run and ruled by slave owners that was to deny in our founding documents rights to most Americans that we now hold true. I can tell some of y'all have not read my essay because of some shell shock happening here. So, I often hear, when I'm crafting this project, I'm always thinking of the arguments. What are the arguments that I get? Because one of the greatest joys of my life is dismantling them. And so in many ways, my essay in this project is the answer to those flawed arguments of people who have bought into a founding narrative that treats us as an exceptional country, but do not want to actually look at the historical record and be honest about the country that we actually were. And one of those myths is that we, as modern day Americans, cannot place our morality on the founders, that those were different times, that somehow we didn't know back then that it was wrong to buy and sell human beings and torture them for labor. That's an irrational thought. Except so many people believe this. And the truth is, if you look at the record, the founders knew, of course they knew. The whole point that you have to torture someone to get them to work gives lie to the fact that somehow slavery was not a problem. And so Thomas Jefferson writes, if there is a just God, we will be punished for the fact that we founded this nation on slavery. The British, who don't want the colonies to break off, are calling out the contradictions of the colonists. And they're saying, you're accusing us of holding you in slavery. Perhaps you should ask the people who are actually living in slavery in your colonies what slavery is like. And they are pushing. Now, of course, Britain is also hypocritical because Britain was the largest slaveholder or slave trading nation in the world at the time. And this proved to be kind of a convenient thing for the colonists. Because how many of you guys have read the Declaration of Independence? Really? Who would like to recite it? Nobody? Okay. If you've read the Declaration, you can go to Washington, D.C., you can look at it. The Declaration that you see is not the original Declaration that Thomas Jefferson drafted. In the original Declaration, Thomas Jefferson tries to confront slavery because of course they know that you cannot be a nation founded on individual rights and liberty while also holding 1/5 of your population in bondage. And so it's actually the longest, if you understand what the Declaration is, the Declaration is a list of grievances. It is laying out the case. These are the crimes that Britain has committed against us. And amongst those crimes, Thomas Jefferson writes about slavery. And it's the lengthiest of all the passages, several paragraphs. And he says that the King of Britain forced slavery on the colonies, forced this institution, and committed this crime against people who did not deserve it. And then he takes that back to the Continental Congress that is going to be issuing this document, and they are like, what the hell are you doing? Because they, of course, know. They have no intention of ending slavery in this new nation. They cannot, because the very wealth that has allowed them to think they could fight a war against the greatest empire in the world is coming from slavery. And nearly half of the founders are directly engaged in the practice of slavery, and many others are indirectly profiting from slavery. So there's no way that we can have this passage in this document because, of course, if you include that passage in the document, you have to abolish slavery at the founding. And so the passage is struck, and a deal is made that we will become a new country built on both slavery and freedom. And that is the country that we become. And then we must go about hiding the crime. We must produce documents that will protect slavery without ever mentioning the word. So if you read the Constitution, which I am positive most of you have never read the whole Constitution, but if you read it, the word slavery doesn't appear in the Constitution until the 13th Amendment is passed to end the institution of slavery. And yet we all know the 3/5 compromise was about how do you account enslaved people in the slave states. But it doesn't use the word because the founders gather behind closed doors and they have many conversations about how do we protect this vital institution but do it in a way where we can hide our hands in this document that we hope to go out to the world and that will become a document for global freedom. And then they must develop a certain psychology then, right? Because if you know that your country is founded on a fundamental hypocrisy, none of us like to be hypocrites, and we all try to hide our sins. So what they decide is that slavery is not actually incongruent with our democracy because our democracy is for human beings and citizens, and Black people are neither. So the we the people is not actually a lie if those people who are enslaved are not people. And there's scholars that show how the racial caste system, the psychology of the caste system begins to harden at that moment of independence, when we can no longer blame our sin on someone else, because we have started our new country and made our own rules. And so that sin becomes our own. And so the dehumanization process of Black people really begins to be entrenched at that point. If Black people are not fully human, if Black people can never be citizens of this country, then none of this is a lie. Our founding documents are not a lie, our Declaration is not a lie, and the idea of America is not a lie. That process becomes entrenched in every aspect of American life. It becomes entrenched in the law. The Supreme Court, which at that time of the Dred Scott decision was a majority enslaver court, rules that not only do Black people not have rights that white men need respect, but that Black people are from a slave race. What that means is no matter if you are free or enslaved, you are from a slave race, and a slave race can never be citizens of the country of their birth. It is the Supreme Court that actually says, no matter that Black people have been here since 1619, before many of the white people who were writing these rules, they could not be citizens of the United States. This idea of Black people being a slave race then of course means that once you are no longer enslaved, you still cannot be treated as a human being. Because I can't say that you're not human during slavery, and then when you are free, say actually you are fully human just like I am. That gives lie to the whole system. And so that is the legacy actually of this belief fundamentally that Black people are not fully human, are not fully citizens, that we still grapple with today. And the architecture of debasing Black people, of really providing the psychological balm to our founding hypocrisy, is found in art, in science that tries to prove that Black people are inferior. It is found clearly in the law. It is found in our politics. These are from some of the slave codes that William Goodell, who was an abolitionist, wrote. When you think, they say that Black women, enslaved women, can't be raped because you cannot rape someone who is not a person. Enslaved people have no right to property. They cannot write a will because they can inherit nothing and they can will nothing. They have no right to their own children. They can be bought, sold, mortgaged, collateralized. They can be used to pay off debts. If you injure someone whom I own, that person has no respite before the law, but I have to pay the owner for damaging his property. This is the legal framework that creates the ability for us to deal with our founding lie. And you see the debasement occurring when we actually had storefronts where Black people were sold as if it was the grocery store. And you have to wonder, how many images of this have we seen, and why have we not seen those images? One of the things we're trying to do with the 1619 Project is mark all of these sites where human beings were bought and sold. And trust me when I say there are slave auction sites in Boston, New York. Wall Street was a slave trading site. All 13 of the colonies practiced and engaged in slavery. This was not ever just a Southern phenomenon. And so we have this paradox of 1776 and 1619. And every 4th of July, Black people, of course, are forced to confront that paradox along with every other day of the year. But in particular, on the 4th of July, and my poor child in my household, I force us to read every 4th of July Frederick Douglass's speech, What to the Negro is the 4th of July. It's a very long speech, and I'm sure when she's older, she's gonna tell me how I traumatized her, but for now, this is what we're gonna do. Because it is important to understand that we were not able to even begin to celebrate the 4th of July for 100 years. And in this speech This is, of course, Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist who we all learn about during Black History Month. We learned that he was a great abolitionist, but not really learn about the institution from which he fled. And in this speech, he is asked to give a 4th of July speech to commemorate the nation's independence. And this speech is basically him saying, have you lost your minds? He asked them, did you bring me here to mock me? You want me to commemorate your 4th of July? And his verbiage is very clear. What to the Negro is your 4th of July? Because my people are in bondage right now. And he probably better than any other writer or person who engaged in oratory was able to call out that hypocrisy of our nation. But also keep in mind, he was speaking to white liberals. You know, y'all probably would have been in that crowd back then. These are abolitionists. These are people who believe that slavery should end, but at the same time expect enslaved people and formerly enslaved people to deify our founding that was based on their enslavement. So we're going to compare another text. The Great Emancipator. I mean, technically, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were the real great emancipators. We are taught, you know, I always talk about how when I was growing up, you go into old school Black homes and there would be 3 people on every Black person's wall, right? Okay, 4. You know, you would have Kennedy, I don't know why, because it should have been LBJ. You'd have Martin Luther King, and you would have Abraham Lincoln, because we are taught that Abraham Lincoln was the great emancipator. And he was. But emancipation was a war tactic. And he is very explicit about this. And he says, if I could keep slavery, maintain slavery, and save the Union, I would. And if I have to end slavery to save the Union, then I will do that. And he realizes during the war, at the time of the emancipation, the war is not going so well for the North. And part of the problem is all of the wealth, but also the labor force of the South is enslaved people. And Lincoln realizes, if I can get rid of that labor source, I might be able to turn the tide of this war. But the problem is, that would mean suddenly 4 million Black people who are never supposed to be citizens and were never supposed to exist in this country outside of our labor would suddenly be free. And what do you do with that? Because if you read Abraham Lincoln's writing, he believed that slavery was morally wrong, that it was a grave sin, but he was absolutely opposed to Black equality. We have to be able, even today, to have a nuanced understanding of how race and racism works. That people can at once believe that slavery is wrong, but also believe that Black people don't belong here and can never be political equals or social equals. So he calls, was somebody clapping for that? I can expand. I'll give you a quick modern day example. I tweeted about this. You can have a Black Lives Matter sign in your yard and still not want Black kids in your children's school. That's basically what I'm saying. You can hold both of these views. There can be things like you can say, I don't believe that unarmed citizens should be shot down by the police. That's a very gruesome thing, but not want integrated neighborhoods or integrated schools. Race exists on a continuum. It's not you're in the Klan or your Mother Teresa. It's not typically how it works. And it didn't work that way with Lincoln either. So yes, he believed slavery was wrong. He thought that slave labor did not allow free laborers to compete. He wanted to expand to the West, and that expansion was to be for free white labor. So he needs to end slavery as a war tactic, but he needs to figure out what to do with the problem. And the problem is 4 million people who should not be part of our democracy. So he calls in this group of elite Black abolitionists who have been fighting and trying to turn Lincoln to use the war as a chance to liberate their people, and he calls them into the White House. And I imagine they were very excited about this meeting. And he calls them in and he says, I'm going to free your people. And then I have secured funds for your people to go somewhere else. Now, why aren't we taught that part of the narrative? And he tells them, we're incompatible. We've done too much to you, and you make us sick. You have to go. And I have secured funding from Congress to pay for you to go to another country somewhere else. And he tried for years, tried to send black people to Haiti, to Panama, back to Africa, though we had never been to Africa. And he also, in that speech, blames black people for the Civil War. So this becomes a common theme, that we are at fault for our own oppression, that we are the obstacle to national unity, that if we were not here, as if we chose to be here in the first place, that America could truly be the country of our ideals, but we are what is standing in the way. And those black men have an answer for him. And the answer is, we built this. Our ancestors fought in every war. The first person to die for the American Revolution was a black man named Crispus Attucks, who himself was a fugitive from slavery. He wasn't even free, and he fought and died for your freedom. And now you're going to tell us that we have to go? So there were small numbers of black people who very logically were like, put us on the next ship out of here. But most black people were not willing to leave the country that they literally had built, the only country that they ever knew, the only culture that they ever knew. And they decided that what they were going to do was stay, and they were going to fight. And they were going to fight to make those founding ideals true. Because while our founders did not really believe in those ideas when they wrote them down, black people took them literally. Black people had no choice but to take them literally. Because if we were going to stay in the country that enslaved us, we had to believe that we could force the country to live up to the words it had written down at its founding. And you see that as soon as freedom happens, they fight and start to make true on that promise that they were going to liberate this country from itself. So you see the passage of the 1866 Civil Rights Act. When we're taught about all of these amendments being passed in the Republican Congress, we're not taught these ideas for these amendments did not originate from white people in Congress who just 2 years before didn't care if slavery continued or not. They originated from black abolitionists who were pushing them on these amendments and pushing for these rights. The 1866 Civil Rights Act to this day is the most powerful civil rights act ever passed. It's never really been enforced, and actually there's a big 1866 Civil Rights Act case that's going before the Supreme Court right now. The 13th Amendment, which ends slavery, ends an institution that some people say doesn't exist in the Constitution. The 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, which says every person is entitled to be treated the same before the law. Every person, not just black people. It is also the 14th Amendment that gives us birthright citizenship. So if you are an immigrant here, if you are an immigrant from Europe, if you are an immigrant from Asia, Africa, South America, you can thank your fellow black American citizens for the fact that your children and you are American citizens. And then, of course, the 15th Amendment, which gives universal franchise for men. It would take a while before women would get the constitutional right for franchise. And you see black people during this brief period of Reconstruction being elected into offices all across the South. It's this amazing period in American history, one of the very briefest periods, 12 years, where we actually try to become the multiracial democracy that we say we can be. And these black legislators go in and they actually help pass, along with white Republicans, some of the most progressive legislation that the South had ever seen. It is because of formerly enslaved people saying we need free education for our children that we get public education in the South for the first time. White children are liberated when black people are liberated, because poor white children for the first time are getting a public education in the South. You see progressive taxing. You see funding for public institutions and a common good. You see efforts to do criminal reform, all being led by those who were formerly enslaved, because those who have never had freedom value it more than anyone. It is the condition that led Black people to make these pushes for the common good. And then 12 years later, of course, we go back to our normal self. And our normal self is we purge those Black people from elected government, we overthrow democratically elected governance all across the South, and we reinstate white supremacy, and white Northern legislatures are willing to look the other way in the name of national unity. It is time to stop worrying about the problem of Black people and get back to being America. And we are left on our own. And so all of those rights that we fought for in the 1860s, right after slavery, we lose again. And there will be a 100-year fight against racial terrorism, generational racial terrorism, in order to simply secure the rights that Black people had already secured once before. Do you ever notice how when you're taught history, you go up to about 1865, they got to talk about slavery so they can talk about the Civil War, and then you go to Martin Luther King giving a speech? There's a lot that happens in between that. And it really is a reinstatement of a quasi-slavery through a sustained racial terrorism campaign all across the country. And Lord knows Indiana has a very bloody and ugly history of that here. But Black people fight again. The story of Black resistance is the common theme through America. Black people are never just sitting back and willingly subjecting themselves to oppression, even though that's often the way that we're taught. And so through another revolution, the second revolution, the second or third founding of this country, Black people fight to reinstate the rights that they were supposed to have already had. The passage of the '64 Civil Rights Act, which ends discrimination in public accommodations, basically reifying the 14th Amendment. The Voting Rights Act, ensuring that Black people can have the right to vote that they had allegedly secured 100 years earlier. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. So the fact that if you are a brown or Black immigrant in this country right now, it is because Black people during the Civil Rights Movement fought to end our racist immigration quota system. Prior to that, in order to keep this country white, there were quota caps on the number of Black and brown people who could immigrate into the United States. So, once again, perhaps instead of coming to this country and trying to distance yourself from Black Americans, maybe thank us for your right to even be here. And keep in mind that once these immigrants are able to come into the United States because of the end of racist quotas, they come into the United States that thanks to Black people dying in a sustained civil rights movement, they have come into a country where legal discrimination no longer exists. Discrimination exists, but not by law. So you already are coming in with a head start thanks to the civil rights movement. And as the sister read in the excerpt from my piece, the thing that we also don't get credit for is as Black people have been the perfecters of democracy, the rights that Black Americans have fought for have always been universal rights. They have never just been rights simply for Black people, but for all people. Every one of these civil rights laws bars discrimination, not just based on race, but on gender, also based on nationality, based on religion. So every person's rights were expanded because of the Black resistance struggle, even though Black people largely fought that struggle on their own. And other rights groups, the women's rights movements, the Native rights movements, Latino rights, disability rights, and the gay rights movement have all used the civil rights laws passed because of Black resistance and the amendments passed after slavery to gain those legal rights. When the Supreme Court rules that gay Americans have a constitutional right to marry, It is using the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause passed after the end of slavery to make that justification. So y'all can thank us for that too. And yet here we are, despite being a people who has had to fight a constant, sustained resistance against our own country. Black people disproportionately joined the service. They have from the beginning, and they joined that service because they hope if they were willing to die for their country may finally recognize them as full citizens. I opened my piece with the story of my father flying his damn flag in our front yard because he joined the military, a man born in a cotton plantation to a family of sharecroppers in Greenwood, Mississippi, who thought if he joined the army, he could be treated as a man in his own country. Yet we are never paid back for that type of loyalty and citizenship. And here we are today, still having to fight for basic recognition and basic humanity and basic fair treatment before the law. It is an unending struggle because Black veterans would go and fight abroad to bring democracy for people who are not Americans and then come home and have to fight their own countrymen because they were being lynched for wearing their uniforms, because they were being denied housing opportunities, the GI Bill that they were supposed to get because they were Black. This is the reality of our country. And when you want to understand why, it's because if you go back to slavery, if you go back to understanding how we have dealt with our founding hypocrisy, it has been to say that Black people are not as worthy, not as human, and not full citizens. And you don't simply purge that type of psychology from your existence. When you think the English landed Jamestown in 1607, it takes 12 years before we in the colonies begin to engage in slavery. 12 years in the history of our country. We don't even decide we want to be a country before another 150 years. We don't end slavery until another 100 years after that. And mind you, I know we think we were, I hear this all the time as well, that, yes, we practiced slavery, but we were the leaders in freedom. We were not. We were the third to the last country in the Americas to end slavery. Only 2 other countries held out longer than us, and we were the only one of 2 countries that required a war to do it. The first being Haiti, and that was enslaved people who became the first in the history of the world to overthrow their masters and become their own country. What that tells you is that we held on to it to the very end, and we nearly tore our entire country apart to save this egregious institution, and now we suddenly feel like we can just be liberated from it because we no longer want to think about it. 1968, 100 years after the end of the Civil War, is when we passed the last of the great civil rights legislation. And then in 1976, the most important moment in all of American history occurs, which is I was born. Now, I'm trying to figure out why people think that's funny. I will acknowledge if there are actual historians in here, they may not disagree with that or agree with that timeline, but it is my speech, so. But in all seriousness, I say that because I was born in 1976. I am 43 years old, and when you look at me in my very youthful face, it is knowing that I am in the first generation of Black people in the history of the United States who was born with full legal rights of citizenship in the country of our birth. I am 43 years old. My father was born into an apartheid America where it was legal to discriminate against you simply because you descended from people who had been enslaved. A decade before I was born, it was perfectly legal to deny me housing. It was perfectly legal to say you can't use the public library that your tax dollars are paying for. It was perfectly legal to say Black and white people cannot marry. All of these rights within one generation before me. There are living victims. There are living victims of that system in this room right now. So we want to say, why can't you just get over it? It was a long time ago. It was not. We fought to maintain that caste system, and we fight to maintain that caste system too. And if you don't acknowledge how recently this history was and how violent the opposition to these civil rights, the 1968 Civil Rights Act doesn't get passed until Dr. King gets assassinated and 100 cities riot. That's what it takes. So it's not like we spend 100 years doing this, and then all of a sudden white people are like, you know what, you're right. We were wrong, everybody's gonna be equal. We fought this. And laws, of course, changed before minds. And you don't change 350 years of white supremacy with 20 years of half-ass trying. It doesn't work that way. So what the 1619 Project is about is saying very explicitly, we need a re-education. We need to be taught the true history of this country, because how can you have the urgency to fix the wrongs if you don't actually understand the architecture that created them? This is our fundamental problem when you say, oh, my ancestors came here with nothing. They were not enslaved. They did not live under a system of racial apartheid. That is not the same thing. Just having inconvenience and struggle is not the same thing as a system of racial caste that was built upon your backs. We have to be able to acknowledge that truth. And then we begin to understand why you see the conditions that many Black Americans and Native people, the two groups of people who did not choose to be a part of America, are the two groups of people who suffer the most. And then you understand that this is intentional and this is systems working as designed. So when I conceived of the project, I said, I want to overwhelm you with the fact that all across American life, all of these things that you think have nothing to do with slavery, we are going to show you through rigorous scholarship that indeed they do, that almost nothing has been left untouched by this legacy, and how could it be left untouched by this legacy? One of the reasons that Indiana is such a harsh red state is because it was a border state, and it developed a psychology because it did not want Black people freeing from slavery to cross into Indiana and settle here. It constitutionally barred Black children from receiving an education because it said, if we don't provide Black people's children education, they won't come here. This is the legacy. So when you look at your schools now, when you look at your state now, where do you think this came from? So if you go through the magazine, if you go through the project, every page, I hope, is a revelation, right? Capitalism. We would not be the wealthy country and the harshness of our capitalism here. When you are founded on the belief that you can literally torture people into profit, then what will you not do for profit? The idea of the Electoral College, that you can win, as some person a couple years ago did, 3 million more votes and still not win the presidency in a so-called democracy, is a direct legacy of slavery, because the Electoral College comes out of that. When you think about why America, of all the Western industrial countries that we like to compare ourselves to, has the stingiest social safety net. We have the lowest maternal leave after you have a baby. We have the lowest rates of union membership. We are the only one of those countries without universal health care. This is all because of the legacy of slavery, and the polling on this is very clear. If white Americans think large numbers of Black people will benefit from a social program, they oppose it even if it hurts themselves. So you think about the Medicare expansion. None of those Confederate states wanted to expand Medicare, though it didn't cost them a dime, and even though there were millions of poor white citizens who needed that expansion, and they didn't expand because they felt that there were proportionally more Black people who would use those benefits. So we are willing, you think that we can contain the harms of slavery and contain the harms of anti-racism just to the communities on which they were built, and the truth is, all of us suffer. All of us suffer. When you can't go to the doctor, you are suffering that legacy of racism as well, because we are connected as Americans, whether we want to believe that or not. When you look at why we incarcerate more people in this country than any place in the world, and disproportionately those are Black, it is because of that caveat in the 13th Amendment that says that you cannot enslave people unless they are convicted of a crime. And so we find a way to re-up that system, even though we cannot reinstate a full system of enslavement. When you look at the American diet, our rates of diabetes, the sugar consumption, it all can be traced back to slavery. Of course, the wealth gap. Of course, the wealth gap. Black people were brought here simply to have wealth extracted physically from their bodies, and even after freedom have never had a chance to actually just develop wealth in a normal way like everyone else, have been systematically left out of the greatest drivers of wealth in this country, continuing to this day. When your ass has to sit in traffic for no godly reason, it is because they built the traffic systems to segregate Black communities, and it was not to get a good flow of traffic to and from, but to keep Black communities away from white communities, and it's nonsensical, and when you sit in Atlanta, you can thank racism for that too. Or Indianapolis, or Chicago, or Detroit. And then, of course, our very sense of who we are right now. This belief that some people should have a right to vote and some people should not. That some people are worthy of full citizenship and some people are not. That is at the heart of who we are as a country. So we have to ask ourselves, when you think about the theme of why we're all here today, maybe some of you take this as a penance. I come make you feel bad for an hour and then you're okay. I'm gonna say we are clearly charged with doing more than that. If we think about the idea of evolution, and we think about the idea of how do you change a society, and almost the only times where we have started to see efforts for real equality in this country has been at the breach of revolution. It is at the Revolutionary War when we're deciding, will we be free, a free nation or not? It is at the Civil War when we finally decide that we cannot sustain slavery anymore. It is during the Civil Rights Movement when there becomes so much violence and northern cities are erupting all over this country, and there is a fear that we are at the brink of revolution, that white Americans finally acquiesce to the rights of citizens for those people who I would argue are the most American of all. So what will it take now? Can we rethink our origins, and in rethinking our true founding and our true founders? Can we move to be the place and the country of our ideals and not the country of our failures? This is the choice. I'm not asking white people in this room to feel guilty for slavery. You don't have to feel guilty for crimes you didn't commit, but you do get to feel guilty for the things you do right now to sustain those systems built on the backs of Black people. The entire point of the 1619 Project was not to be a history. It was to say, look right now. This is the living legacy. These are the living harms. And then to say you have to be forced to confront that and to do something different. You are responsible for the choices you make today. You are not responsible for the choices someone else made, but you have to understand the architecture that allowed you to be where you are and that has kept other people in the conditions that they're in. And so the revolutionary concept, I think, or hope, that is the 1619 Project, is what if we could ask that finally, after 400 years, Black people stop being treated as the problem in this country, and really that you recognize the most pure patriotism to believe in a country that didn't even think you had the right of citizenship, to fight and not leave, but work to make your founding ideals true, that actually Black people have always been the solution to this country, even as we have been treated as the problem. This, of course, is the framing that made conservatives lose their mind. I've been writing about race my entire career, and no conservatives ever cared about anything that I've ever written. But when I argue that those who are the bottom, who have been always treated as the bottom and the problem were actually the central and the solution, that's when people lost their minds, because they're so used to seeing us in a certain way and teaching a history that demeans and degrades us instead of upholds the truth of our patriotism. So I'm wrapping up, y'all. Don't worry. If we look at the last election, you see that patriotism. I think part of the reaction to the 1619 Project has been many white Americans woke up in 2016 and saw that they lived in the America that Black people have always lived in. And all of a sudden, y'all wanted to understand, wait, what is this country that I thought I knew? And the 1619 Project is the red pill in the matrix. It exposes the architecture of how this was all built. That's why my hair is red right now. So when we have this election of a man who runs on a white nationalist platform, on a man who runs on the Muslim ban, on the idea that women don't have rights to their bodies, and the idea that Mexicans are rapists who are ruining our country, and we are told that the reason people are voting for him is economic insecurity. Except we know no one in this country is more economically insecure than Black folks. At the best of times, we have double the unemployment rate of white Americans. I don't care what the economy looks like. We have 1/10 the wealth, no social safety net. Our children are the most likely to fall out of the middle class than any other group. That is economic anxiety. And yet, we did not vote for that man. But lots of white Americans did. And the fear is lots of white Americans will again. So when you understand that Black folks who had every right to say, I don't need immigrants coming in here competing for the low-wage jobs that I can barely get myself, who had every right to be stingy about America, instead said, no, we are going to vote for the America of our ideals. That speaks to the role that we have always played. 98%. That's in the margin of error. I believe it was 100% of Black women, actually. Now, Black men, of course, as usual, had some issues. Little bit lower than Black women, but still highest of any other group. We vote again and again to save this democracy and to save this country from itself, and we never get the credit for what we do, but we do it anyway. So, if we think of revolution and we think of a new origin story, I'm going to leave on what has become my new parable, which is if you want America to be the country that it should, trust Black women, especially this one. Thank you.
Okay. So you know we're not just turning you out of here to go home immediately. Because here's the thing. We just heard some really provocative and some really thought-provoking essays, poems, and remarks. And the easy thing to do, the comfortable thing to do, is to go home and think about it ourselves. Or it's to write a question on one of those comment cards that we gave you and to send it up here and to let Nicole field some questions. The uncomfortable thing to do is to turn and talk to each other again. The uncomfortable thing to do is for us to pose you the question. and for you to wrestle with each other on some of the answers that we need to explore as a community to move past this. So in the lead-up conversation to this evening with the students from IUPUI and IU, when they met with Nicole, that's what they were tasked to do, was to come up with a question for you to wrestle with. And Nicole's going to ask that question. We're going to ask you to write your answers on those cards that you were given. And we encourage you to turn to somebody around you and to talk with them about your answer. And we're going to give you a few minutes to do that, and we're going to filter some of those responses back down here. If we have a few minutes, we'll read some of them aloud. But this is on you, folks. This is on us. Changing this, it is up to all of us, and that's what we're putting back on you right now. So what, you want to share the question?
Yes. Let me just say that standing ovation might make me change how I feel about Indiana, so y'all did good. True. That's true. Okay, so we came up as a group with basically a two-part question, which is whether you've read the 1619 Project or just heard my speech today, how does this reframing really change you and your understanding of your country and your role in it? But much more importantly, what is your responsibility and what is the personal action that you will take to get us closer to those ideals? Thank you. You got 5 minutes or so. Oh, 5 minutes to solve racism, get it?
If you have a response you'd like to share, just try to have the card make the way to the aisles. Myself and we've got a couple of volunteers walking around to collect them. just another minute or two, so if you want to turn in your answers, we'll gather those up. I am also going to try to summarize all of these and email answers back to all of you later. So this is a way for you to also share with each other after the event. All right, folks, thanks for participating. We've asked Ms. Anna Jones to just pick out a couple of your answers and just kind of read off a few of them that resonated with her, give us a feel for what's being thought about here in the audience.
Okay. I really feel like I need y'all to go back to the drawing board. Now, now y'all like gonna take back that applause. So there were a lot of cards about how people are going to educate themselves and educate other people, and that clearly is important. That's the role of journalism. But that's also the easiest possible thing that like actually doesn't cause anyone to have to give anything up to actually change the inequality in our society. So I'm going to ask, not that we pass out more cards, but that when you leave today, you go home and be a bit more reflective about what actual hard thing that will challenge your life and your beliefs are you willing to do? And look in the mirror and ask yourself, do you really want equality or not? Because you can't read the 1619 Project and see the architecture and all of these structural inequalities, an unearned advantage, which doesn't say you haven't worked hard, but it just says you have unearned advantage. And then your answer is that the hard thing you will do is just to educate. There has to be more to that. So I'm going to read some of the answers that I think get more centrally, and then I'm going to just offer a few suggestions. So one person said that they are going to trust Black women. Thank you. Support Black women, help keep Black women safe, and elect Black women to political office, which I think are all great things. But the most important part came at the very end, which is pay reparations. So the 1619 Project does not make an explicit argument for reparations yet, but it is coming. And I think we cannot acknowledge this harm, this ongoing harm, this theft of wealth, this theft of education, this theft of job opportunities, the theft of quality living conditions, and then not say we need to do something to repair that harm. That is what reparations are, and you have to question why the opposition specifically to Black people being paid restitution has been so great. And if you repair that harm, once again, we're all connected. Actually restoring some of what was lost and stolen will help all Americans, not just Black Americans. So I think we need to think more carefully about that. And that's actually a little easy thing for y'all to do. It's like 5 cents more in your taxes or something like that. The other card that came up here was a woman said she wanted to use, I'm assuming it's a woman by the writing, that could be sexist. A person said that they wanted to use their privilege to minimize inequalities when possible. I'm going to tell you how it's possible, because it's always possible. Are you fighting for school integration in your city? Are you fighting for affordable housing to go into wealthy white neighborhoods in your city? If you're not fighting for those things, then your other efforts at reducing inequality are not going to lead to any structural change. It actually has to be much bigger and much more challenging than that. And the last thing, now this is the one. It's not an action, but, and I'm not sure what the action would be. Maybe the action would be the theme of this whole talk, which is revolution. But this person wants to question whether capitalism and democracy are a lie. I think democracy is a lie because we don't fully have it, but it is the right thing to do. Now, the question about capitalism is something else to be resolved, and I won't be the one resolving that. But anyway, I thank you all for your thoughtfulness, but I really, really do hope that you leave here and try to think of what is the hard thing that you're going to do going forward, not the easy one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. All right, I'm going to invite Song Squad to come back out on the stage, and I want to just, as we close today, I want to thank all the people, all the organizations that make Spirit in Place possible. We want to thank the dozens of volunteers who've worked for the last 10 days. Did any of you go to festival events? Yeah? Did you have a good time? Yeah? All the partner organizations, our volunteers, our many donors and contributors who support us through gifts large and small. And I want to pay special tribute to the extraordinary staff of Spirit in Place who work all year long to make this magic happen. And they are Jana Thomas, LaShonda Crow-Storm, and Aaron Kelly. And as we go from here tonight, I wanna follow up on that question and ask you, how are you going to stand up for this as you walk from here? How are you going to go out into the world and stand up for democracy in these ways? How are you going to stand up at the Thanksgiving family dinner? It's true, right? How are you going to stand up at work? How are you going to stand up in your house of worship? How are you going to stand up in all the places that you occupy? And as we sing this last song together, we want you to think about that, about how you and how we are going to stand up.